The morning Nora Calloway learned she had inherited something was the same morning her electricity was shut off. She did not notice right away. She had been awake since before 5, sitting at the kitchen table in the gray half-dark, going over the same column of numbers she had gone over the night before and the night before that. The notebook was cheap, its cover soft from handling, its pages filled margin to margin with figures that never seemed to agree with each other no matter how many times she added them up. The rent was due in 11 days. The truck needed a rear brake line. Her youngest had a field trip that cost $42, and she had told the school she would send the form back by Friday, and it was already Wednesday, and she still did not have $42 she could let go of without something else falling short. She had been a woman who managed. That was how she thought of herself, quietly and without ceremony. Not a woman who thrived, not a woman who got ahead, but a woman who managed. She kept the lights on and the pantry stocked and the girls in clean clothes, and she did it the way her mother had taught her, which was without complaint and without asking anyone to notice. When she finally reached for the lamp on the counter and the switch did nothing, she sat for a moment in the dark and let herself feel the weight of it. Not the electricity specifically. The electricity could be restored with a phone call and a payment she would figure out how to make. What she felt was the accumulated weight of every small failure that had preceded this one, the quiet, grinding arithmetic of a life that spent more than it earned no matter how carefully she tried to balance the two. She pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed slowly. The house was still around her. The girls were asleep. The world outside the window was just beginning to decide whether it would be a pale morning or a dark one. She told herself the same thing she always told herself in moments like these. You get through today, and tomorrow becomes something you can figure out. She was rinsing her coffee cup by the pale light from the window when her phone buzzed on the counter. The number was not one she recognized, an area code from a part of the state she had not thought about in years. She answered because she always answered. A woman who managed could not afford to let calls go to voicemail. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Gerald Pruitt, and he introduced himself as an attorney in Harlan County, and he asked if he was speaking to Nora Calloway, formerly Nora Vess. She said he was. He paused briefly, the pause of a man preparing to deliver news he was not entirely sure how to frame. Her Uncle Raymond, he said, had passed away 3 weeks prior. She had not known Raymond was sick. She had not known much about Raymond at all for the better part of 15 years. He had been her mother's younger brother, a quiet and solitary man who had farmed tobacco in the Eastern Hill Country and kept mostly to himself after her mother passed. They had exchanged cards for a few years after the funeral, and then even that had faded. She remembered him as a man with large, careful hands and a way of watching things before he spoke about them, as if he was making sure he understood something fully before he committed words to it. She had liked him without knowing him well, which was its own kind of grief when she thought about it now. Gerald Pruitt continued. Raymond Vess had died without a spouse and without children, and his estate, such as it was, had passed according to a will drawn up for years prior. Nora was named as the sole beneficiary. She stood very still in her kitchen. The water was still running in the sink, and she reached over and turned it off. What does that mean exactly? She asked, and she kept her voice level the way she always kept her voice level. The estate consists primarily of real property, Mr. Pruitt said. A parcel of approximately 62 acres in Harlan County, including the farmhouse, various outbuildings, and a tobacco curing barn. The house has not been occupied for some time. The barn similarly. There are no liquid assets to speak of, some farm equipment in poor condition, some personal effects. The property itself carries a small amount of back taxes owed to the county. She did her arithmetic the way she always did arithmetic. 62 acres of unoccupied farmland in the Eastern Hill Country with back taxes owed was not a gift. It was an obligation dressed in the language of inheritance. But it was something. She was not in the habit of turning away somethings. She told Mr. Pruitt she would come. She told him she would need a few days to arrange it. She hung up the phone and stood in her kitchen with the pale morning light coming through the window over the sink, and she looked at her notebook of numbers and thought for the first time in longer than she could remember that maybe the numbers could be different. It was a fragile thought. She handled it carefully. She told her sister first because her sister lived closest and would need to watch the girls, and her sister's reaction told her everything she needed to know about what other people would say when they heard. Pam was 3 years older and had a husband and a mortgage and a particular way of pressing her lips together when she wanted to convey concern without admitting she was being dismissive. She listened to Nora's account of the phone call, and then she pressed her lips together and said, "So he left you a broken-down farm." Nora said it was 62 acres and a farmhouse and several outbuildings, including a tobacco barn. Pam nodded slowly the way people nodded when they were deciding how to dismantle an argument without seeming unkind. "Tobacco farming is finished, Nora," she said, "has been for 20 years in that part of the state. Whatever Raymond had out there, he couldn't make it work, and Raymond was a man who knew the land. What makes you think you could do anything with it?" Nora said she was not planning to farm tobacco. She was planning to see what she had before deciding what to do with it. Pam pressed her lips together again and said nothing more about it, which was in some ways worse than if she had argued. Her brother-in-law, a man named Darren who had opinions about most things and stated them without being asked, said over dinner that evening that back tax farmland in Harlan County was worth about as much as a hole in your pocket. He said that with the warmth of a man who considered himself helpful. He said the sensible thing would be to let the county take it and save herself the trouble of a 6-hour drive. Her neighbor Bet, who was 71 and watched the girls sometimes and meant well in the specific way that well-meaning people sometimes did not, said she thought it was a shame that poor Raymond hadn't had anyone to look after him in his last years, and that she hoped the county wouldn't end up taking everything he'd worked for, which was not what Nora had asked her, but was very much what Bet wanted to say. None of it changed anything. Nora arranged for Pam to have the girls for 4 days, and she packed a bag with work clothes and a change of everything else, and she filled the truck with gas she put on the credit card she was trying not to use, and she drove east. She drove through 3 counties and watched the land change around her, the flat, open stretches giving way to rolling hills, and the rolling hills giving way to ridges and hollows, and the particular kind of country that folded in on itself and kept its own counsel. She had not been to Harlan County since her mother's funeral, but the land had a way of looking familiar even when you had been absent from it long enough that familiarity should have faded. Some landscapes stayed in the body even when the mind let go of them. She met Gerald Pruitt at his office on a Wednesday morning. He was a soft-spoken man in his 60s with reading glasses. He kept pushing up his nose in a manner that was neither warm nor cold, simply professional in the way of men who had spent a long career delivering news of all kinds to people who needed help absorbing it. He walked her through the paperwork with patience and gave her a folder of copies to take with her. The back taxes amounted to just over $8,000, owed in 2 installments. He told her the county had been lenient given the circumstances, but that there was a timeline. She had 90 days before the situation became more complicated. He gave her the keys to the farmhouse and the barn, a set of old keys on a ring with a plastic tab that said Vess in faded marker. He gave her directions to the property and told her the house had power run to it, but that the account had been in Raymond's name and would need to be transferred. He said he was sorry for her loss, and he seemed to mean it. She thanked him and walked out into the pale March sunlight with a folder of papers and a ring of keys and the particular kind of quiet that comes from being handed a responsibility you are not entirely sure you are equal to. She found the property without difficulty. The directions were plain, and the road that led to it was the kind of country road she had grown up driving. 2 lanes of old asphalt with grass growing through the cracks at the edges and a line of fence posts running alongside it that had been put in by someone with a careful eye and repaired by people who no longer were. She turned at a mailbox with Vess painted on the side in letters that had mostly survived the weather, though the V had begun to peel. The drive was a 1/4 mile of packed gravel that narrowed as it approached the property, passing through a stand of bare-limbed trees that in summer would have formed a canopy, but in early March admitted the gray light without apology. The farmhouse appeared first. It was smaller than she remembered, though she had only been here twice as a child, and memory tended to enlarge things from that distance. A white clapboard house with a green metal roof, its paint weathered but not failing, its porch solid-looking but stacked with old equipment she couldn't immediately identify. The windows were intact. The chimney stood straight. It looked like a house that had been stopped midlife rather than abandoned, like a sentence cut off before the period. She sat in the truck for a moment and looked at it. She was not a sentimental woman by nature, but she understood the difference between a place that had been given up on and a place that had simply been left, and this felt like the latter. Raymond had not given up on it. He had simply run out of time. She took the folder and the keys and walked up the porch steps. They did not creak in the way of neglected wood. They held. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air was close and cold and carried the particular smell of an empty house, wood and old fabric and the faint ghost of meals cooked long ago. The furniture was still there. Not much of it, and not the kind that spoke of comfort so much as function. A table for chairs, a wide wooden shelf with a line of canning jars that still held their contents in various shades of amber and red. The floors were pine, their boards wide and worn smooth by decades of use. She walked through each room slowly, the way you walk through a place you were trying to understand rather than simply see. The bedroom held a metal bed frame and a bare mattress. The bathroom was small but complete. The kitchen had a gas range and a sink with a hand pump alongside the faucet, which told her something about how the house had been built and how Raymond had lived in it. She ran the tap. Water came, slow at first and then steady. She noted it without celebration. Water was practical. So was the wood stove in the main room, still holding ash in the box, a pair of iron tools standing beside it in a stand that someone had made by hand. She spent an hour in the house and came to a conclusion she had known she would probably come to before she even arrived. This was not a ruin. It was rough, and it was cold, and it needed work in the particular methodical way that things neglected for a few years always needed work, but it had bones. It had structure. Someone had built it to last, and Raymond had maintained it without making it shine, which was the habit of a man who cared about function over appearance, and she understood that because she was the same way herself. Outside, the land spread in every direction with the quiet authority of land that had been worked and rested and worked again over generations. The fields were fallow now, their soil dark and compact under the thin March crust. She could see fence lines in the distance and the shapes of what looked like a small equipment shed, and beyond that, at the far edge of the cleared land where it began to slope toward a line of trees, the tobacco barn. She saw it from 100 yards and felt something she could not name shift in her chest. It was large, larger than she had expected, larger than was standard for a personal farm operation of the size Raymond had run, which was something she noted and then filed away without drawing conclusions. Tobacco barns in this part of the country were built for function in a specific and demanding way, tall enough to stack the bundled leaf from floor to ceiling with room for the curing flues, wide enough to accommodate several seasons of harvest, built with ventilation slats in the siding that could be opened and closed to regulate the air. This one had all of those features and several more besides. The siding was rough-sawn oak, dark with age and weather, and while some boards had warped at the edges and one section on the south face showed signs of an old repair with newer lumber, the structure as a whole was sound. The roof was standing metal, aged to a dull brown, with no visible sags or failures. The foundation was stone, dry-laid and mortared at the corners, and the mortar had cracked in places but had not given way. She walked toward it the way she had walked through the house, without hurrying, letting her eyes take inventory. There were 2 large sliding doors on the main face, steel-tracked and padlocked with a heavy chain. There was a smaller door set into the east wall, also padlocked but with a different lock, older and heavier, the kind made before manufacturers started making things to be replaced rather than maintained. She tried the smaller key on her ring first, and it did not fit the large chain. The third key, she tried to open the small door. It swung inward on hinges that protested briefly and then found their range, moving with the weight of metal that had rarely been disturbed. The interior was dim, lit only by the weak light that came through the ventilation slats, thin horizontal strips of pale gray that striped the floor and walls. She stood in the doorway and waited for her eyes to adjust before stepping fully inside. The smell hit her before the sight did. Tobacco, old and deep, the smell of cured leaf that had soaked into the wood over decades of seasons. It was not unpleasant. It was specific, the way a smell could be specific without being sweet, the smell of labor made tangible. As her eyes settled into the light, the barn resolved itself in sections. The main floor was large and open, the original hanging frames still in place overhead, rusted iron hooks on oak crossbeams at regular intervals. Old equipment stood against the walls, its function not immediately clear to her. Mechanical things built for the particular choreography of tobacco work: stripping, tying, hanging, curing. At the far end of the main chamber, a partition wall ran the full width of the barn, heavy plank timber with a single wide door in the center. She crossed the main floor slowly, her boots on the packed earth making a sound that seemed larger in the silence than it should have. The door in the partition wall was not locked. It opened inward to a smaller room, narrower than the main chamber, its ceiling lower. This was the curing room. She had read enough about the old tobacco operations in this county to know what it was immediately. The original flue system was still partially in place. Cast iron pipes running from a central firebox along the baseboard, designed to circulate heat through the room without open flame. The practice that distinguished fire-cured from air-cured leaf, the particular method the eastern Kentucky farms had used for the burley that had once made this region its reputation. The firebox itself sat in the center of the floor, a squat iron structure mounted on a low stone platform, its door hanging open and empty. Around it, the floor was different from the main barn floor. The main barn had packed earth. This floor had boards, wide planks of old-growth timber, dark and dense, fitted together with the tight patience of someone who had understood that a floor in this room needed to hold heat and hold level over generations of use. She stood in the curing room for a long time. The light from the ventilation slats was less here, coming in at an angle that left the corners in shadow. The smell was stronger, richer, as if the wood itself were still breathing out the memory of every harvest that had passed through it. She looked at the walls, the ceiling, the old flue pipes, the firebox. She looked at the floor. She looked at it again. Something in the arrangement of the boards was not entirely uniform. It was subtle enough that she might have dismissed it entirely if she had not been a woman who spent her life looking at the specific geometry of limited resources and learning to read what they told her. Two sections of the floor, near the far wall, sat slightly differently from the rest. The boards there were the same timber, the same darkness, the same width, but their edges met in a pattern that diverged very slightly from the rhythm of the rest of the floor. Not by much. Not in a way that would register to someone moving through quickly or looking for something else. But she was not moving quickly, and she was not looking for something else. She was looking at what was in front of her. She crouched down and ran her fingers along the seam where the boards met the others. The fit was close but not seamless. There was a line of deliberate separation, faint but present, running in a rectangle roughly 4 feet by 6 feet. Positioned 3 feet from the far wall and offset from the firebox by an angle that felt, to her body if not yet her mind, like it had been calculated. She sat back on her heels in the dim light of the curing room. She did not move for a long moment. The barn was absolutely quiet around her. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees at the property line, and the sound was faint and remote. The keys were still in her hand. She was aware of the weight of them in a way she had not been when Gerald Pruitt had handed them across his desk that morning. She stood up slowly. She did not have the tools she needed with her. She did not have a pry bar or a flashlight or any of the equipment that the situation, now forming clearly in her mind, seemed to call for. What she had was the knowledge that the floor of her uncle's curing room had a section that did not belong to the rest of it. That section had been put there by someone who knew what they were doing. And her Uncle Raymond Vess, a man who had farmed this land for 40 years and died without a wife or a child or a liquid asset to leave behind, had chosen her name when it came time to decide who would inherit what he had here. She walked out of the curing room and through the main barn and out the small door into the thin March light, and stood for a long moment looking at the land around her. The fields lay quiet. The farmhouse stood at the end of the drive. The bare trees moved at the edges of the property. Nothing looked extraordinary. Everything looked like what it was. And yet she felt the kind of stillness in her chest that she recognized from the moments in her life where the arithmetic had been about to change. She drove into the nearest town that afternoon and bought a flashlight and a pry bar and a pair of work gloves and a bag of supplies from the hardware store that the man behind the counter did not look twice at, because they were the supplies of a person doing practical work on a property, and in a county like this, that was simply the ordinary business of living. She paid in cash. She had a little cash because she always kept a little cash, because a woman who managed knew that sometimes the systems between you and what you needed failed at inconvenient moments, and you needed something solid in your pocket. She drove back to the property as the light began to tip toward late afternoon. She told herself she was going to look at the floor again with better light. She told herself she was being practical rather than hopeful. She was aware that these two things were not always as different as she made them sound. She let herself back into the barn through the small door and crossed the main floor to the curing room and knelt on the floor with the flashlight. The beam was strong and clean, and it showed her what the dim slat light had only suggested. The seam she had noticed was exactly as she had seen it. Deliberate, careful, and set into the floor with the kind of craft that did not announce itself, but revealed itself to anyone patient enough to look. She pressed the flat edge of the pry bar into the seam and applied careful, even pressure. The boards resisted, as old boards always did when they had been fitted well, but they moved. The give was slow and controlled, the sound of seasoned wood releasing from a position it had held for a long time. She worked along the seam methodically, not forcing anything, moving the bar a few inches at a time, and allowing the wood to release before applying pressure again. The section came up as a unit rather than separate boards, which told her it had been built that way, a fitted panel constructed to be lifted rather than a random arrangement of planks that happened to have settled together. She set it aside carefully. The flashlight showed her the hollow beneath. It was not a simple trench or a rough excavation. It was a constructed space, its walls lined with dry-stacked stone set and mortar, its dimensions precise, its depth approximately 3 feet. The lining was old. She could see then the color of the mortar and the age of the stone, but it was intact, and it was dry, and it had been built by someone who understood that what it held needed to be protected from moisture and temperature variation and the ordinary passage of time. She shone the light into the far corners. She breathed slowly. She let her eyes take in what was in front of her. Arranged on the stone floor of the hollow, fitted edge to edge in rows that filled the space with the careful economy of a person who had thought hard about making the most of what was there, were objects wrapped in heavy oilcloth, the cloth itself dark with age, but unrotted, sealed at the edges with wax that had hardened and browned but held. The objects were uniform in shape, rectangular, dense-looking, even wrapped, with the particular quality of things that held their weight close to themselves and did not shift when you expected them to. There were many of them. She could not count them all from where she knelt, because the hollow extended further than the light showed, clearly, and the rows continued back into the shadow. She did not reach in. She did not touch them. She knelt on the curing room floor of her uncle's tobacco barn in the last of the March daylight, and held the flashlight steady, and looked at what was in front of her, and felt the arithmetic of her life begin, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to move in a direction she had not imagined possible. The flashlight beam held. The wrapped objects held their silence. And she held very still, understanding that the next thing she did would be the first step in a story she could not yet see the end of. She did not open them that night. The decision came from somewhere steadier than impulse, from the part of her that had spent years calculating what she could afford and what she could not, and which understood, without having to reason it through entirely, that opening something you did not yet understand was the kind of action that could not be undone. She replaced the panel over the hollow with the same care she had used removing it, fitting it back into its seam and pressing it flat until the floor looked as it had when she first entered the room. She swept the wood dust from the pry bar's work toward the edges of the room, where it would blend with the ordinary debris of a long-unused space. She switched off the flashlight and stood in the curing room in the dark and listened to the barn settle around her. The old timber made sounds that belonged to itself, small compressions and releases as the temperature continued its slow evening drop. She went out through the main barn and padlocked the small door behind her. She walked back to the farmhouse in the near dark and let herself in and sat at the kitchen table in the cold and tried to think clearly. The things she knew for certain were few and specific. There was a constructed hollow beneath the floor of the curing room. The hollow contained wrapped objects of uniform size and weight. The hollow had been built with skill and care and sealed against time. Her Uncle Raymond had known it was there. He had known it was there, and he had left for the land and had not left her a note or a letter or any explanation at all, and she did not know yet what to make of that silence. The things she did not know were significantly more numerous. She did not know what was in the wrapped objects. She did not know how long they had been there. She did not know whether her uncle had put them there or had inherited them the way she was inheriting everything else. She did not know whether whatever was in that hollow was Raymond's to give or whether it belonged to someone else or to no one or to a history she had not yet been told. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The house was cold and quiet around her. She thought about the attorney Gerald Pruitt and his careful manner and his folder of paperwork. She thought about the back taxes owed and the 90-day timeline. She thought about her girls asleep in her sister's spare room 6 hours west of here. She thought about the notebook of numbers on her kitchen table at home and the column that never balanced and the $42 she still didn't have for the field trip. She thought about Darren saying the land wasn't worth the drive, and Pam with her pressed lips and her careful concern, and Bet saying she hoped the county wouldn't take everything Raymond had worked for. She pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed slowly. Tomorrow she would open one. She would open one carefully, and she would look at what was inside, and then she would decide what to do next. That was how she had always done things. One step at a time, taken with both eyes open, without rushing toward a conclusion before the information was in front of her. She got up and found Raymond's wood stove and discovered he had left a small store of split wood in the box beside it, dry and ready, the last practical gift of a man who had known that whoever came here next would be cold. She built a fire with the patient skill of a woman who had grown up with a wood stove and knew the difference between building a fire to show you could and building one to last through the night. The iron body of the stove ticked and expanded as the heat rose. The farmhouse began by degrees to lose its chill. She unrolled her sleeping bag on Raymond's mattress and lay in the dark listening to the fire work and the house breathe and the wind. Outside, doing what the wind did in this kind of country at this time of year, which was to make itself known without apology. She thought about Raymond. She thought about his quiet hands and his way of waiting to understand something before he spoke about it. She thought about a man who had lived on 62 acres of hill country farmland and died without a liquid asset to his name and had left all of it to a niece he had not spoken to in 15 years. She thought about what a man like that might have known and kept to himself, and how long he might have kept it and why. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did sleep, she dreamed of nothing she could remember in the morning. The morning came with pale light through the bedroom window and the smell of the wood stove's last heat cooling in the iron. She dressed in her work clothes and made instant coffee on the gas range with water from the tap and drank it standing at the window that looked out toward the barn. The barn stood where it had always stood, its dark siding absorbing the early light, its metal roof holding the overnight frost in a line along its peak that would be gone by mid-morning. It looked ordinary. It looked like exactly what it was, an old tobacco curing barn on a fallow farm in Harlan County, the kind of structure that existed in its hundreds across this part of the state, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what was underneath its floor. She finished her coffee and put the mug in the sink, and picked up her flashlight and pry bar and walked across the frost-stiff grass toward it. She had decided in the night, in the hours before sleep came, that she would bring nothing else with her yet. No camera, no phone, nothing that created a record before she understood what the record might mean. This was a habit of caution she had developed over a lifetime of managing with limited resources and understanding that information was a kind of resource too, and that how you handled it in the early moments determined a great deal about what happened afterward. She let herself through the small door and crossed the main floor and entered the curing room. In the morning light filtering through the ventilation slats, the room looked as it had the day before. She knelt at the section of floor she had replaced and began again with the pry bar, working the seam with the same care, the same patience, the same controlled and deliberate pressure. The panel came up as cleanly as it had the first time. She set aside. The hollow was exactly as she had left it, the wrapped objects in their rows, the oilcloth undisturbed, the mortar-lined walls dry and unchanged. She reached in and lifted the nearest object. Its weight settled into her hands like a decision. Heavy, dense, heavier than the size of it suggested it should be. She sat on the floor beside the hollow and unwrapped the oilcloth slowly. The wax seal at the edges cracked and released, brittle with age, and the cloth fell open in sections. What lay inside caught the morning light from the ventilation slats and held it in a way that the surrounding wood and stone did not. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time without moving. The gold bar was approximately the size of a thick paperback book. Its surface was dull in the way that pure metal was dull when it had not been polished. Not the bright yellow of jewelry, but the deeper, more serious color of a substance that had been refined to its essence and then left alone. It bore markings she could not immediately read. Numbers, a stamp, a set of characters in a language she did not recognize. The corners were precise, and the edges were true, and the whole thing had the quality of something manufactured rather than found. Something made by people who understood metallurgy and process, and the particular requirements of a standard that other people would accept without argument. She was not an expert. She had no training in anything that would let her assess what she was holding with professional certainty. But she was a woman who had spent her entire adult life understanding exactly what things were worth and what they were not, and she understood with a clarity that needed no verification that what she held in her hands was real and was valuable in the way that very few things a person encountered in an ordinary life were valuable. She looked back into the hollow. She counted the wrapped objects in the first row. 8. She looked at the rows behind them. The hollow extended further than she had fully registered the night before. The rows continued in the shadow, and she shone the flashlight into the far end and counted again, and then sat very still on the cold plank floor of her uncle's curing room and felt something she had not felt in so long she had to search for its name. It was not joy exactly. It was not relief, though those things would come later. It was the specific and overwhelming sensation of the arithmetic changing all at once, every column adjusting simultaneously, every number that had been stubbornly negative shifting towards something that had no limit she could yet see. She rewrapped the bar in its oilcloth and placed it back in the hollow exactly where she had found it. She replaced the panel and pressed it flat and stood up and dusted her knees and walked out of the curing room and through the main barn and out the small door into the morning. She padlocked it behind her. She walked back to the farmhouse and sat at the kitchen table. She put the flashlight and the pry bar on the table in front of her and sat with her hands in her lap and breathed until the breathing was steady. Then she picked up her phone and called Gerald Pruitt. He answered on the second ring. She told him she had been to the property, and she had some questions about the nature of the estate and specifically about what the will said regarding the contents of the buildings and structures as distinct from the structures themselves. There was a brief pause while he found the document. The will, he said, bequeathed to Nora Calloway all real property and all personal property contained therein, including but not limited to structures, equipment, furnishings, and any other material assets present on the premises at the time of execution. She asked him when the will had been executed. For years ago, he said. She asked whether Raymond had met with him personally to draw it up. He had, Pruitt said. Raymond had been deliberate about it and had reviewed the language carefully before signing. She asked if Raymond had said anything at the time about specific contents or items he wanted to make sure were included. There was a longer pause this time. Pruitt's voice, when he spoke, was measured and careful. He did say one thing, the attorney said. He said he wanted to make sure the language was broad enough to cover anything stored on the property, including anything below grade. Below grade, Nora repeated. Yes, Pruitt said quietly. He was specific about that phrase. She sat at the table for a moment after she thanked him and ended the call. Below grade. Raymond had known. He had known for at least 4 years, and probably for much longer than that. And he had sat across from Gerald Pruitt's desk and chosen his words with the same careful patience he brought to everything and made sure that what was below the floor of his curing room would pass to her without ambiguity and without question. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about a man who had lived simply and worked his land and kept himself to himself for 40 years. And she thought about what it would mean to know that your floor held something of the magnitude she had just held in her hands, and have kept that knowledge as quietly as he had kept everything else about himself. She thought about why he had left it to her. She had no answer to that yet. But she had time, and she had the habit of patience that a life of managing had given her. And she understood that some questions revealed themselves in their own sequence and could not be hurried without losing something essential. What she did next would determine everything that followed. She had learned that much, at least, from the life she had lived so far. She looked out the farmhouse window at the barn, sitting dark and quiet at the edge of the cleared land, and she made herself a cup of coffee and sat with it, and thought slowly and carefully about every step she intended to take from this point forward. She spent the rest of that morning in the farmhouse, going through Raymond's things with the systematic attention of a woman who had learned that understanding came from details rather than from the broad shape of events. She had not come to the property looking for an explanation of what she had found. She had come to see what she had inherited. But now that she had seen it, she understood that the explanation was the only thing standing between her and a series of decisions she was not yet equipped to make, and she approached the search the same way she had approached every other difficult task in her life, which was to begin at the beginning and move forward without skipping anything. Raymond had kept his papers in a metal file box on the shelf in the bedroom closet, the kind of box sold in hardware stores for the purpose of fireproofing documents that mattered. It was not locked. Raymond had not been a man who expected people to go looking through his things, and in that respect, she supposed he had been right, since she was the first person to stand in this closet in some time, and she had not come looking for anything. She set the box on the bedroom floor and went through it systematically, not skimming, but reading the way you had to read things that had been organized by someone else's logic and might yield their meaning only if you understood how they had filed it. There were the ordinary documents of a life lived on land. Deed to the property, dated to the year Raymond had bought out the remaining interest from their mother's estate after she died. Tax records going back nearly 2 decades. Each year's return filed in its own envelope. An insurance policy on the farmhouse and outbuildings, paid current through the previous October. A maintenance log for the well and the septic, entries in Raymond's particular handwriting, small and upright, and spaced with the same precision as everything else he did. Receipts for farm equipment, some of them old enough to be irrelevant, and some of them current enough to suggest he had still been intending to work the land within the last few years. Tucked beneath the tax records, in its own envelope separate from everything else, was a folded letter. It was not addressed to her by name. It was not addressed to anyone. It was written in Raymond's hand on plain ruled paper, 3 pages, the ink dark and deliberate, the pressure of a man who had been thinking carefully about every word before he committed it. She sat on the edge of Raymond's bed and read it in the thin light from the bedroom window. He had written it based on a date at the top of the first page, 2 years before he died. He had not sealed it or labeled it, which she thought was intentional. Raymond was not the kind of man to put something important somewhere it could not be found. He had put it where someone going carefully through his things would find it, which meant he had expected her to find it, or had hoped she would, or had understood that whoever he left this land to would be the kind of person who went carefully through things. The letter began without preamble, because Raymond had never been a man for preamble. He wrote that he wanted her to understand some things before she decided what to do, and that he was sorry he had not found a way to tell her in person, and that he hoped she would read what followed with the patience he knew she had, because he had watched her mother raise her, and her mother had been the most patient woman he had ever known in a life that had not given him many occasions for patience himself. She paused there and looked out the window at the bare trees along the property line for a moment, and then she kept reading. He had found it 23 years ago. That was how he put it. He had found it, as if it were a thing you stumbled across rather than a thing whose origin required explanation. And she understood reading that sentence that he was going to give her only what he felt she needed and not all of what he knew, and that this, too, was deliberate. He had been leveling the floor of the curing room during a renovation he had undertaken in the autumn of his 41st year, intending to relay the boards over a moisture barrier because the floor had developed a soft spot near the firebox, and he was tired of working around it. When he pulled the old boards up, he found hollow. He wrote that his first thought had been that he was looking at a root cellar of some kind, an old storage space built by the original owners and forgotten, which was not uncommon in farmhouses and outbuildings of that era in this part of the country. His second thought, when he cleared the dirt from the first wrapped object and felt its weight, was that he needed to stop moving and think very carefully before he did anything else. He had been a practical man all his life, and he remained one in that moment. He did not open the wrapping that night. He covered the hollow and went back to the farmhouse and sat at his kitchen table, which was the same table Nora had been sitting at that morning, and he thought. He thought for 3 days before he went back. He wrote that those 3 days were some of the longest of his life, and that was a sentence that cost him something to write. She could tell, because Raymond was not a man who made that kind of admission about himself. On the 4th day, he went back and opened one, and then a second, and then he sat on the curing room floor for a long time and understood that his life had changed without his permission. The bars were gold. He did not know how many there were because he did not count them that day. He wrote that he had been afraid to count them, as if the number would make it more real in a way he was not prepared for, which she found to be one of the most human things she had ever read about her uncle. He counted them eventually. She would count them herself in due course, and she would understand then what he had understood in that curing room, which was that the number was the kind of number that reorganized everything you thought you knew about the life you were living. He had done research. He had done it carefully and slowly, the way a man did research when he could not ask questions out loud and could not trust a library computer in a county where everyone knew your name. He had traveled to 3 different cities over the course of 2 years and used public libraries under various pretexts, and had read everything he could find about gold storage, about provenance, about the history of this region and what it had produced, and who had moved through it in the decades before and after the war. He had developed a theory, and he wrote about it with the measured language of a man who understood the difference between what he knew and what he suspected. The property, before Raymond had bought it, had passed through several hands in a relatively short period of time in the years following the Second World War. Before that, it had belonged to a single family for nearly 50 years, a family whose patriarch had operated a coal interest in the county alongside the tobacco farm, and who had, by all accounts, accumulated significant wealth in a period when significant wealth in this region was almost always held in forms that did not require a bank's cooperation to maintain. Raymond believed the gold had been placed in the hollow by someone in that family, or at that family's direction during a period of considerable economic and political uncertainty, when holding wealth in something that could not be inflated or regulated or seized through institutional channels had a logic that a careful man could understand. He wrote that he had not been able to determine who specifically had made the decision or under what circumstances, and that after a certain number of years he had stopped trying to find out, because the answer, whatever it was, did not change what he had. He had considered many things. He had considered calling the government. He had considered hiring a lawyer. He had considered calling their mother, who was still alive when he found it, and he had thought about that possibility for a long time before deciding against it. Not because he distrusted her, but because he understood that the weight of knowing was a weight he could not in good conscience put on another person if he could carry it himself. He had considered selling the property and walking away from it and letting whoever bought it deal with whatever they found. But he was not built for that kind of thing, he wrote, and besides, the land was worth keeping. So he had kept it. He had kept the land, and he had kept the secret, and he had lived his life the same way he had always lived it, carefully and without waste, and he had not spent a dollar of what was under his floor because he could not figure out how to spend it without explaining where it came from, and he had not been willing to do that explaining. He had not been willing to because some part of him understood that the gold did not belong to him in any way he could justify, and that knowledge had been enough to make him leave it where it was. But he had not been able to destroy it or give it back to a ground that had already kept it long enough, and he had not been able to leave it to no one, which was what would happen if he died without a will and the county came in and processed his estate in their ordinary procedural fashion. He had chosen her because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had been the most honest person he had known, and because he trusted that she would understand that what he was giving her was not a simple gift, but a complicated one, and that the complication deserved to be honored rather than avoided. He had ended the letter with a single practical paragraph. He wrote that he had consulted no attorneys about the gold, and had engaged no appraisers and had made no record of it anywhere outside of this letter, which she was holding. He wrote that he believed the provenance, given the age and circumstances, was sufficiently obscured that a careful, patient, legally sound approach could result in a legitimate claim, but that she would need professional guidance that he had not been equipped to seek without drawing attention he was not willing to draw. He wrote that he was sorry it was complicated. He wrote that he was sorry he had not found a better way. He wrote that she was the only person he had trusted and know what to do with it, and that he hoped she would be able to figure it out, because in his experience, she had always been able to figure things out that seemed, from the outside, too difficult to manage. She folded the letter back into its envelope and sat on Raymond's bed for a long time. The practical part of her mind had already begun moving before she finished reading. It moved in the way it always moved when she had a problem she did not yet know the full shape of, which was to catalog what she knew and what she needed to know and what the sequence of correct steps looked like before she took any of them. She needed an attorney, not Gerald Pruitt, who handled estate law in this county and who she liked, but who was not equipped for what she was looking at. She needed an attorney who understood property law in the context of historic assets and provenance and the particular legal landscape that surrounded gold of uncertain origin. She needed an appraiser or assayer who could tell her what she actually had, its weight, its purity, its markings, its approximate value. She needed to do those things in a sequence that protected her at every step and created no record that existed before she was ready for a record to exist. She was a woman who had spent 15 years managing a household on an income that required her to know exactly what every dollar was doing at every moment. She understood the architecture of financial decisions in a way that people with more money often did not, because people with more money could afford the occasional mistake, and she could not. The thought of what was under the floor of the curing room did not make her reckless. It made her more careful than she had ever been. She spent 2 more days at the property before she drove home. She did not open the hollow again. She spent the time going over the farmhouse and the outbuildings with the methodical attention she had brought to everything since she arrived, assessing what needed doing and in what order and at what cost. She made notes in a small spiral notebook she had brought with her. She took photographs of the property on her phone, the farmhouse, the barn, the outbuildings, the fencing, the fields. She photographed the exterior of the curing room and the interior of the main barn and the floor of the curing room from the doorway. Nothing that showed the hollow or indicated what lay beneath, just the documentation of a woman assessing a property she had inherited. She called the county tax office and spoke to a clerk about the back taxes and explained she was the new owner and asked about the timeline and payment options. The clerk was civil and patient and told her 90 days was the hard deadline, but that they had worked with new estate owners before and there was some flexibility in how payments were structured if she wanted to discuss it. She said she would be in touch. She called Gerald Pruitt and asked him to transfer the utility accounts into her name, and he said he would handle the paperwork. She behaved in every transaction and every phone call like a woman who had inherited a complicated property and was being responsible about it, because that was exactly what she was. She drove home on a Friday and arrived after dark and thanked Pam for keeping the girls and reassured her that the property was in better shape than expected and that she was going to figure out a plan for it. Pam pressed her lips together and said she was glad it hadn't been a total waste of time, and then asked if she wanted to stay for dinner, which was Pam's way of apologizing without apologizing, and Nora said yes because the girls were glad to see her and because she was tired, and because sometimes you accepted what people offered even if the offer came wrapped in the particular clumsiness of people who had doubted you. Darren said nothing further about the land being a hole in her pocket. He had the grace, at least, to let that one rest. The attorney she found was named Catherine Meade, and she was a woman in her mid-50s who practiced out of a small firm in Lexington and whose specialty, according to her website, was estate law with a concentration in property rights, historic asset claims, and litigation involving disputed ownership. Nora had found her through a combination of research and a referral from a woman she knew who had gone through a complicated inheritance dispute several years back and had come out on the right side of it. She called Catherine Meade's office on a Monday and was told the earliest available appointment was 2 weeks out. She said she would take it. 2 weeks was manageable. She had managed longer waits on things that mattered. In the meantime, she did her research. She went to the public library on her lunch breaks from the nursing home, where she worked 2 days a week, and she used their computers, and she read everything available about the legal status of found property, about treasure trove law, about the distinction between abandoned property and property of uncertain provenance, about how states handle claims on historic assets when the original owner could not be identified. She read about gold, about its marking systems, about how bars were stamped and by whom, and what the stamp could tell you about their origin and date of manufacture. She took notes in the same small spiral notebook she had used at the property, and she kept the notebook in her bag at all times and did not leave it anywhere. She told no one what she was researching. The librarians were accustomed to people using the computers for extended research without explaining themselves, and she gave them no reason to look twice. When she met with Catherine Mead, she brought the letter. She had thought about that decision for most of the 2 weeks. Showing the letter meant showing Catherine everything Raymond had written, including his account of choosing not to report the discovery for 23 years, which was not necessarily incriminating, but which was the kind of detail that complicated things. Not showing it meant asking Catherine to help her navigate a situation without giving her the full context, which was a different kind of problem because good attorneys worked best with complete information and incomplete information led to mistakes. She showed it. Catherine read it without expression, the professional stillness of a woman who had been reading difficult documents for a long time and had learned not to let her face comment before her mind had finished its work. When she finished, she sat on her desk and looked at Nora directly. She asked a series of questions, clear and sequential. Had Nora opened more than one of the wrapped objects? Only one, Nora said. Had she removed anything from the hollow? She had not. Had she told anyone about what she found? No one. Had she made any attempt to research the gold through channels that might have created a record? She had researched the legal framework only, she said, at a public library. Catherine nodded at each answer with the expression of a person tallying a score. When the questions were done, she leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This is manageable." She said it with the same flat certainty that Nora used when she said that about things in her own life. It was the phrase of a person who had seen worse and knew exactly what they were looking at. Catherine Mead laid out the framework. The first step was a professional appraisal, conducted by a credentialed assayer under attorney-client privilege. This would establish what Nora actually possessed before any claim was filed or any conversation was had with any authority. The second step was a title and provenance search, which Catherine would conduct in parallel, tracing the property's ownership history as far back as documentation allowed, and building the case for the chain of custody that connected the hollow and its contents to the land Nora now legally owned. The third step, depending on what those first two steps revealed, was a formal claim under the applicable state law governing found property and historic assets on privately owned land. Kentucky law, Catherine said, was more favorable than many states in this regard, particularly when the claimant was a documented property owner and the asset could not be connected to any living prior owner through a verifiable chain. She mentioned that the age of the gold, if it proved to be what Nora believed it to be and from the era she suspected, would work significantly in her favor. Assets held in the ground for more than half a century under property that had changed hands multiple times occupied a particular legal space that was not as contested as people often assumed. She did not promise outcomes. She was careful about that. But she said the foundation was solid and the approach was clear, and she had worked cases with less to go on. Nora paid the retainer from a savings account she had been building for 8 months against a specific hope that it would be needed for something. She had not known what that something was when she started the account. She had simply understood that hope without a fund behind it was only a feeling. The appraiser was a man named Thomas Greer who operated out of Louisville and who had, according to Catherine's description, handled estate appraisals involving historical currency, bullion, and precious metal artifact for the better part of 30 years. He came to the property on a Thursday in late March, 12 days after Nora's meeting with Catherine, on a cool afternoon with a low gray sky that gave the fields the particular look they had when rain was still hours away. Nora had driven back to Harlan County the night before and slept in a farmhouse and had the wood stove going when Greer arrived in a clean sedan that looked out of place on the gravel drive. He was a compact, precise man, not much given to conversation, which suited Nora well. He brought a kit that looked like a professional camera case and carried it into the barn without being asked to explain it. Catherine had come separately and was already in the curing room when they arrived, having driven down from Lexington that morning. The three of them stood in the curing room together, and Nora lifted the floor panel, and they looked down at the hollow in silence. Greer took a long time looking before he touched anything. He used a flashlight of his own, more powerful than Nora's, and moved it methodically across the contents of the hollow, examining angles and surfaces and the condition of the oilcloth wrappings with the concentrated attention of someone reading a text in a language they were fluent in but wished to be precise about. Then he lifted one bar and unwrapped it and turned it in his hands without speaking, and his expression shifted in the specific way expressions shifted when something matched what had been hoped. He took readings with instruments Nora did not know the names of. He photographed the markings. He examined the oilcloth itself and the wax ceiling. He went back and forth between bars over the course of nearly 3 hours, not examining every one completely, but sampling with the systematic logic of someone who understood that a statistically valid sample told you what you needed to know without requiring you to unwrap 100 objects before you had established the baseline. Nora watched him work and said nothing. Catherine stood at the edge of the room and said nothing. The barn was quiet around them, and the sky outside had begun to release its rain in a soft and persistent way that made the ventilation slats weep thin lines of water down the interior wall. At the end of the 3 hours, Greer wrapped the last bar he had examined and returned it to the hollow and straightened up and looked at Catherine. His assessment, he said, was preliminary and would be supported by laboratory analysis of the samples he had collected, but he could speak to what he had seen with reasonable confidence. The bars were gold. High purity, he said, somewhere in the range of 95 to 98%, which was consistent with production standard from certain periods and certain mints. The markings on the bars he had examined were consistent with European origin, mid-20th century, he said, from 2 different sources that he could identify provisionally based on the stamp patterns. Some bore markings consistent with Swiss production from the late 1930s and early 1940s. Others had markings he was less immediately certain about, but which were consistent with a smaller number of possible sources from the same approximate period. He said the condition of the bars was exceptional given their age and storage circumstances, which he attributed to the quality of the oilcloth wrapping and the wax ceiling and the particular temperature and humidity conditions of a well-built masonry-lined underground space in a tobacco curing barn, which, he said with the mild precision of a man making an observation rather than a compliment, was about as good a natural storage environment as you could construct without specialized equipment. He said that without a full count and complete laboratory confirmation, he could not give her a number with professional confidence. She said she understood. She asked him what he could tell her about the range, given what he had seen. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man deciding how to be accurate without being irresponsible. He said the bars he had examined individually ranged between 25 and 30 kilograms each, which was a standard production weight for bullion of that period. He said the hollow appeared to contain between 100 and 120 bars based on his visual assessment, though he would need a full inventory for certainty. He said current spot prices for gold bullion of this purity, combined with the historical significance of bars of this particular origin, which added a premium that could be substantial depending on provenance documentation, put the preliminary value of what was in the floor of this curing room at somewhere between $250 million and $350 million. He said this without ceremony, the way he said everything precisely and without performing the weight of it. He said the lab results and full inventory would narrow the range considerably. He said he would have his written preliminary report to Catherine within 10 days. The number moved through Nora the way very large things moved through her, slowly and from the center outward. She did not speak immediately. The rain was steady on the barn roof above them, and the sound of it was consistent and neutral and she focused on it for a moment the way you focused on something ordinary when something extraordinary required time to settle. Catherine looked at her. Nora looked back at Catherine, and she saw in the attorney's face the careful absence of celebration, the professional restraint of a woman who understood that they were at the beginning of a process, not the end of one, and that the number on the floor was not money in Nora's hand and would not be for some time yet, and might not be exactly that number when it arrived. She understood all of that. She also understood that the column that had never balanced in her kitchen notebook was not going to balance the same way it had balanced before. Not after today, not ever again. She thanked Thomas Greer. She thanked Catherine Mead. She replaced the floor panel, and they walked out of the curing room and through the barn and into the rain, which had settled into a gray and steady downpour that soaked the fields and ran off the barn roof in sheets. That night in the farmhouse, she sat at Raymond's kitchen table and wrote a list. Not of things she wanted to buy, or debts she wanted to pay, or plans she had for the life she was about to be able to afford. Those thoughts were there, moving at the edges, and she did not try to suppress them because they were honest and she had never had much patience for dishonesty, even with herself. But the list she wrote was a practical one. Steps, sequence, timeline. What needed to happen next, and in what order, and what she could do to make each step go cleanly. She wrote for a long time, and the rain came down on the metal roof, and the wood stove worked at the cold, and the farmhouse held its warmth around her the way solid things held warmth when they had been built with care by people who understood what they were making. She thought about Raymond. She thought about him sitting in this same kitchen with this same knowledge pressing on him and choosing, year after year, to do nothing with it because he could not figure out how to do something with it without compromising things he was not willing to compromise. She did not judge him for it. She understood it. She also understood that the difference between them, the only essential difference, was that she had arrived at this moment with Catherine Mead's car in her bag and a clear sequence of steps written in her notebook, and Raymond had arrived at his equivalent moment alone in a county where everyone knew his name and without a single person he trusted enough to bring into it. She was grateful for Catherine. She was grateful for the 2 weeks she had spent in the library. She was grateful. In a particular way, she was grateful for things that had cost her, for the 15 years of managing that had made her exactly the kind of woman who knew what to do when the arithmetic changed without warning and you had to respond before the moment passed. In the 10 days that followed, Catherine's office pursued the title search with the focused efficiency of people who knew what they were looking for and where to look for it. The property's history, traced through deed records, estate filings, tax documents, and county archives, went back to the early 1890s. The original parcel had been considerably larger, part of a land grant to a family named Alderman who had farmed and mined in the county for 3 generations. The last alderman to hold the full parcel had been a man named Chester Alderman, who had died in 1951 without a direct male heir, his only child a daughter who had married and moved to Ohio in the 1940s. The property had been sold by the daughter's estate in 1954 to a man named Harold Pruitt, who had held it for 11 years before selling it at a loss in 1965. Thereafter, it had changed hands 3 more times before Raymond bought it in 1978. What Catherine found in the Alderman records was not conclusive, but it was suggestive in ways that mattered. Chester Alderman had operated coal interests in the county through the 1930s and into the war years, and had maintained extensive commercial relationships with European trading concerns during a period when such relationships were common in the coal and mineral export trade. His financial records, insofar as they had been preserved in county probate filings, showed the kind of irregular deposits and withdrawals in the early 1940s that were consistent with the movement of assets outside conventional banking channels, which was not unusual for men of his type and time who had reason to distrust institutions that had recently shown themselves capable of failure on a significant scale. There was no document that said Chester Alderman had acquired gold bars from European sources and hidden them in the floor of his tobacco curing barn. There was also no living alderman with a claim. The daughter had died in 1987. Her children had no documented connection to the property and had made no claim on any portion of it in the 60-plus years since the sale. The legal picture that Catherine assembled was not simple, but it was workable, and working it was what she was paid to do. Thomas Greer's laboratory results arrived on a Thursday. The bars were gold. Purity averaged 96.4% across the full sample, which was consistent with his preliminary estimate and with the production standards of the sources he had tentatively identified. The laboratory had confirmed his assessment of the markings and had narrowed the Swiss production to a specific mint active between 1938 and 1944. The second source was identified as a smaller smelter that had operated in Belgium through the same period and had processed gold from various origins during the economic dislocations of those years. Neither source had any active claim mechanism or successor institution that could assert ownership over product of this age and in circumstances of this kind. Greer's full inventory, conducted on a second visit to the property accompanied by Catherine and a bonded inventory specialist, established the count at 109 bars with an average weight of 27.3 kilograms each. His formal appraisal valued the collection at $315 million, accounting for spot price, purity premium, and an estimated collector and provenance premium that was, by his language, conservative given the historical significance and exceptional preservation of the pieces. $315 million. The number was in a document with Thomas Greer's credentials on the letterhead and his signature at the bottom, and the document was in Catherine Mead's file, and the file was part of a formal claim that Catherine had now prepared and would file with the appropriate Kentucky authorities. The process from this point, Catherine told her, would take months, possibly longer. There would be a period of review, a public notice requirement, a window during which any potential claimants could come forward, and then, assuming no valid claim materialized, a formal determination. She was preparing Nora for the length of it, because the length was the thing people most frequently underestimated and most frequently allowed to undo them by making them impatient or careless. Nora said she understood. She said she had been managing on a timeline that required patience for 15 years. Catherine said, "Good, because you're going to need it." The news began to move in the way news moved, not all at once, but in a seep. She had not told anyone. She had been careful beyond what even Catherine had asked her be, telling only her attorney and her appraiser, and keeping the property locked, and her own counsel absolutely. But legal filings created records, and records were public documents in the specific sense that they could be found by people who looked for such things, and someone had looked. She did not know who first. She suspected it was someone at the county recorder's office who noticed an unusual asset claim and mentioned it to someone else in the way of small county, where unusual things were social currency. What she knew for certain was that on a Thursday in mid-April, 6 weeks after she had first knelt in the curing room and lifted the floor panel, her phone began to ring with numbers she did not recognize and did not answer, and a message was waiting from Gerald Pruitt when she checked her voicemail, asking her to call him, his tone careful with the particular care of a man who had heard something and wanted to understand it before it got away from him. She called him back. He asked, with the measured delicacy of a man trying to be tactful and not entirely succeeding, whether there was something she had discovered on the property that she had not mentioned to him at the time of their initial conversation. She told him that her attorney had advised her not to discuss the matter with anyone while the formal claim was in process. He received this with a silence that carried its own content. He said he understood. He said he hoped things went well for her. She thanked him, and they said their goodbyes, and she sat with the phone in her hands for a moment, knowing that Pruitt's call was not the end of it, but the beginning of a different phase. She called Pam. She told her because Pam was her sister and because Pam would find out anyway, and finding out from someone else would be worse. She told her as plainly and completely as she was able to, the same way she always told Pam things, which was directly and without softening the parts she thought Pam might push back on. She told her about the curing room and the hollow and the gold and Raymond's letter and Catherine Mead and Thomas Greer and $315 million. Pam was silent for a long time when she finished. Longer than Pam was usually silent. Then she said, "Nora," and that was all. Just the name, with all the weight of revision pressing behind it. The revision of a woman who had pressed her lips together and used the word sensible, and who was now looking at the cost of sensible from a new and uncomfortable angle. Nora did not make her say more than that. She had never been interested in the satisfaction of being right out loud. The arithmetic had changed. That was enough. She did not call Darren. She let Pam handle that. She did not call Bet. She had enough on her mind. That evening she sat at her own kitchen table, the one with a notebook that had never balanced, and she opened the notebook to a fresh page. The column of numbers she wrote was different from any she had written before. It had room in it that the old columns had not had. She let herself sit with that for a while, the specific and overwhelming relief of a problem that had resolved itself not through a small adjustment, but through a fundamental shift in the conditions. She thought of her girls asleep in their rooms. She thought of Raymond in his farmhouse. She thought about what patience was worth when you finally had something to be patient for. Outside, the spring night was quiet around the house, and the window was dark, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the dark outside did not feel like pressure. It felt like space, the kind of space a person needed to figure out what came next. But figures and filings and appraisals were one kind of problem. The kind of problem Nora knew how to manage. What was coming next was something different. It was the problem of other people, of the world reforming itself around a new fact, of the scrutiny and the complications and the reaching hands of people who had not been interested in her before. That problem she had not yet learned the shape of. She was about to. The problem of other people arrived in several forms, and none of them announced themselves cleanly. The first was the press. A reporter from a regional newspaper in Lexington called Catherine's office on a Monday and left a message that was professionally worded and entirely clear in its intention, which was to confirm rumors about a significant asset discovery connected to an estate claim filed recently in Harlan County. Catherine called Nora immediately. They had discussed this possibility and prepared for it in the way you prepared for whether you knew was coming, not by hoping it wouldn't arrive, but by deciding exactly how you would respond when it did. The response was silence. Not the silence of someone with something to hide, but the deliberate, strategic silence of a woman whose attorney had advised her that speaking publicly before the claim was resolved was the single fastest way to complicate a process that was going well. Nora did not call the reporter back. Catherine's office released a single statement confirming that a legal matter pertaining to an estate asset was in process and that no further comment would be made until the matter was resolved. The statement was 4 sentences long and said nothing. It was, Catherine explained, exactly the right length. The press did not go away. It never did when a number was large enough to override the ordinary reluctance people had about other people's business. Within a week, the regional story had been picked up by 2 national outlets, each of whom had done enough research to report that the asset in question was gold that had been discovered in an inherited tobacco barn in eastern Kentucky, and that the preliminary value was in the hundreds of millions. Neither outlet had Nora's name yet. Catherine had been careful about what appeared in the public filings, and Kentucky law gave them some room on that. But the stories were specific enough that anyone in Harlan County who was paying attention would be able to point a reporter in the right direction. And Harlan County was not a large place, and it had been paying attention since the day Gerald Pruitt made his first careful phone call. She began to notice cars she did not recognize on the road that ran past the property entrance. Not always. Not in a way she could have pointed to in a single instance and said with certainty that it was anything other than coincidence, but often enough that the pattern registered. She kept the barn locked, and she kept her distance from the property until Catherine advised her it was safe to return, which was not for some weeks. The second form was the lawyers. Not Catherine, who was hers, and who was doing exactly what she was supposed to do. The other kind. Within 3 weeks of the claim filing, 2 separate inquiries arrived through official channels. One was from an attorney representing a man who identified himself as a descendant of Harold Pruitt, the second owner after the Aldermans, who had held the property in the 1950s and 1960s. The Pruitt descendant was claiming that any asset on the property during his ancestors' ownership would have passed as part of that estate and therefore represented an interest his family had never been compensated for. The claim was thin, Catherine said, reviewing it with the practiced economy of someone reading an argument they had already anticipated. It was thin because Harold Pruitt had sold the property, which meant he had disposed of any interest in what was on it at the time of sale, and because there was no documentation establishing that Pruitt had ever known the hollow existed. which was the essential problem with any claim of this kind. Knowledge mattered. A man could not claim an asset he had never known he was selling. Still, the inquiry required response, required documentation, required Catherine's time, and therefore Nora's money. And that was, Nora understood, part of its purpose regardless of its legal merit. The second inquiry was stranger. It came from an overseas attorney whose correspondence was in English, but whose letterhead bore an address in Zurich. The letter was precise and formal, and stated that certain assets of European origin believed to have been transported to the United States in the 1940s were the subject of ongoing restitution proceedings, and that the current inquiry was preliminary in nature. Catherine read it twice, and then sat quietly for a moment before she spoke. This one, she said, is different. It's different because it's real. She explained the landscape, not in the hopeless way of someone describing an obstacle too large to overcome, but in the careful way of someone mapping terrain that could be navigated if you moved correctly. Swiss restitution claims related to gold from the wartime period existed in a legal framework that had been actively developed and refined over the previous 3 decades. They were not automatically valid. They required documentation of a chain of ownership that connected specific bars to specific accounts or transactions, and that chain had to survive scrutiny from both directions. The markings on Nora's bars, Greer had noted, were consistent with Swiss production, but were not necessarily traceable to a specific private account or transaction. Catherine said she needed to see what the Zurich attorneys actually had, which might be nothing more than a broad inquiry triggered by a public filing that matched certain search parameters they maintained, or it might be something more specific. She said she would find out, and she would do it carefully. Nora asked how long. Catherine said she would have a clearer picture within 60 days. 60 days was a long time when you were a woman who had paid a retainer with the last of a savings account built over 8 careful months, and when the back taxes on the property were approaching their deadline, and when the girls needed the field trip payment and the truck needed brakes, and the electricity had been restored only because Nora had put the bill on the same credit card she was trying not to use. But 60 days was not forever. She had waited longer for less. She borrowed from her sister during that period. She did not want to, which was precisely why she did it, because wanting not to borrow from people and refusing to borrow from people were the same habit in a woman who had too much pride and too little money, and she had spent 15 years learning the cost of that particular confusion. She asked Pam directly, without softening the ask, for a specific amount, and she told Pam what it was for, and Pam said yes immediately in a voice that had something new in it, something that was not condescension or concern or the particular careful warmth of a person managing their relationship with someone they had underestimated. It was simply yes, without the pressed lips. Nora took the money and paid the back taxes and paid the credit card and paid for the brake line and gave the girls their field trip money with $6 left over. She told the girls they were going to be okay. She had been telling them that their whole lives and had meant it in the complicated way of a woman who believed it was true without being sure she could prove it. This time she meant it differently. She meant it in the particular way you meant a thing when you could see the shape of the proof from where you were standing. The Zurich inquiry resolved itself in the manner Catherine had cautiously hoped it would. The preliminary claim was based on a broad search of restitution databases that flagged gold of Swiss origin reported in any legal proceeding, an automated net rather than a specific targeted claim. When Catherine's office requested the documentation underlying the inquiry, the response that came back was thin. The Zurich attorneys had a general mandate and a general search mechanism, and they had caught a flag in the filing. They did not have a specific account, a specific owner, or a specific transaction that could be tied to bars of the type and marking structure that Greer had documented. Without that specificity, Catherine said, the claim could not proceed. It would require a level of documentation they simply did not have, and she had engaged a specialist in this area who had reviewed the case and confirmed that the markings and production history of Nora's bars did not appear in any of the active restitution databases that were maintained for precisely this kind of search. She wrote her response to the Zurich office with the composed authority of a woman who had done the work and knew what it showed. The inquiry was withdrawn within 30 days. The Harold Pruitt descendant attorney also withdrew, not because the claim had been adjudicated against him, but because Catherine had provided enough documentation about the nature of the sale and the legal principle of unknown assets that continuing would have been expensive in proportion to its chances, and the attorney had apparently advised his client accordingly. These were not dramatic victories. They did not come with public statements or visible moments of triumph. They came as documents in Catherine's file, quiet confirmations that the path was still open and that the work of keeping it open had held. That was enough. The formal determination came on a Tuesday in late August, 5 months after the initial filing. Catherine called her at 7:30 in the morning, earlier than she usually called, which told Nora before she had heard a word what the call contained. The reviewing authority had completed its examination of the claim. No valid competing claim had been sustained. The asset was confirmed as belonging to Nora Calloway as sole heir to the estate of Raymond Vess under the terms of the executed will and applicable Kentucky property law. The gold was hers. Catherine said it without ceremony because ceremony was not their register, but Nora heard the particular quality in her voice that lawyers had when something they had worked for arrived where they had intended to bring it, a kind of professional satisfaction that was different from joy but was its own real thing. Nora thanked her. She hung up the phone and sat at her kitchen table and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed. The morning light was coming through the window above the sink, and it was the particular light of late August, already warmer than it looked, already certain of itself in the way of light at the end of a long season. She thought about Raymond. She thought about him finding what he had found and carrying it alone for 23 years, working his land and filing his taxes, and maintaining his well and curing his tobacco and keeping his secret in the way of a man who had decided that the weight was his to carry, and that was that. She thought about what it would have meant to him to know that the thing he had kept had arrived where he had intended it to arrive and had been honored the way he had hoped it would be. She could not ask him. She had not been able to ask him for 15 years, and now she would not be able to ask him ever. And that was a grief she had been carrying underneath the practical weight of the last 5 months, and that now, in the quiet of her kitchen on a Tuesday morning in August, she allowed herself to feel in full. She sat with it for a while. She did not rush it. She had learned that grief, like everything else, required its proper time. Then she stood up and made coffee and began to think about what came next. The liquidation was not simple, but it was managed. Catherine had anticipated it and had brought in a specialist firm with experience in handling bullion collections of significant value through institutional channels that were both legally sound and discretion-preserving. The bars were transported from the property under secure conditions to a bonded facility, inventoried fully, and transferred through a series of transactions that spread the conversion across multiple buyers over a period of 4 months, which was Catherine's recommendation to avoid the price suppression that could come from trying to move a collection of this size all at once. The final realized value, accounting for the various premiums and the costs of the process, was $312 million. The tax liability was substantial and was handled by a firm Catherine recommended that specialized in sudden high-value gains, another category of problem Nora had never encountered before and which required its own set of careful steps. When all of it was done, when the taxes were paid and the fees were settled and the accounts were established and the numbers had resolved themselves into something she could look at without her vision blurring, Nora sat with a financial advisor named Marcus Chun who had been recommended by Catherine and who was also not given a ceremony, and he walked her through what she had. She had enough. That was how she thought about it privately, in the language she had always used. She had enough. The specific number behind the word enough was different from any number she had ever put behind it before, but the word itself was the right one, because what she had always wanted was enough, and she had spent 15 years learning exactly what that word meant to her, which turned out to be more useful information than most people ever had the occasion to develop. She paid the back taxes in full, which was already done. She paid off her mortgage, the 11 years remaining on it, in a single payment that she made online on a Wednesday afternoon while the girls were at school, and she sat for a moment afterward looking at the confirmation on her screen with an expression she was glad no one was there to see, because it would have been impossible to explain. She set up college funds for both girls, fully funded, with enough to cover graduate school if they wanted it. She established a small family trust at Marcus Chin's recommendation, structured for long-term management. She paid off Pam's mortgage as well, without telling her first, and when Pam called in a state of suspended disbelief to ask what the document from the bank meant, Nora said it meant she was paying her back with interest and she hoped Pam would accept it. Pam made a sound that was not a word. Then she said she did not know what to say. Nora said that was all right. She did not say it was the first time. She was not interested in those kinds of observations. She set up a foundation in Raymond's name. She had thought about this more than any other decision, had thought about it in the farmhouse and on the drive home and in the weeks while Catherine's process ran its course, and she had arrived at it not as a sentimental gesture, but as a practical one. Raymond had been a man who believed in land and in the people who worked it, and who had lived his whole life in a county that was dying by the measure of every statistic anyone cared to apply, where the tobacco economy was gone and the coal economy was gone, and what remained was people with deep roots in difficult ground and not enough tools to do anything with either. The Raymond Vest Foundation, as she established it, was modest in scope and specific in mission. It provided grants to small farm operations in eastern Kentucky for equipment, soil remediation, and agricultural diversification programs. It provided educational support for students from the county who wanted to study agriculture, land management, or environmental science. It funded the preservation of 3 rural structures in the county that were on the historical register but had no resources for their maintenance. It was not large enough to solve the county's problems because there was no sum that was large enough for that. But it was large enough to matter to specific people in specific ways, and that was what Raymond would have understood and respected. She kept the property. That surprised some people, including Pam, who had assumed that the first thing Nora would do with money was sell the land that had produced it and buy something else entirely. But the land was the thing, and she had understood that from the beginning. She did not intend to farm it herself. She was not a farmer, and she did not pretend to be. But she repaired the farmhouse and the outbuildings with the same methodical attention she had brought to everything since arriving that first March morning, hiring local tradespeople who knew the kind of work these structures needed and who did it with the pride of people whose work would stand up to decades of use. The tobacco barn she restored carefully and completely, working from photographs and with the advice of a preservation specialist who understood what the structure had been and what it could be again. The curing room floor was relayed in the original pattern. The hollow below was filled with concrete and sealed. She did not feel this was erasing anything. She felt it was the right end for a space that had held something extraordinary for as long as it needed to and could now be allowed to simply be what it was, part of a floor in an old barn on a piece of land that a woman named Nora Calloway owned free and clear and intended to keep. Darren did not say anything about the land being a hole in her pocket when she saw him at Pam's birthday dinner in September. He said he was glad things had worked out. He said it with the particular awkwardness of a man who understood he had been wrong in a visible way and was hoping the visibility would fade. She told him she appreciated that. She did not make it harder than it had to be. Bet when Nora told her the broad outlines, cried in the way that older women sometimes cried about good things that happened to people they cared about, the accumulated relief of a person who had been worried on someone else's behalf for a long time. Nora hugged her and meant it. Gerald Pruitt called to congratulate her, and she thanked him sincerely and told him she intended to keep the property and that she would be in touch if she needed anything further. He said he was glad, and she believed him. The people who had doubted her were not villains. They had simply not been able to see what she had not yet known herself when she walked through Pruitt's door that March morning with a folder of papers and a ring of keys. She did not hold it against them. She had spent too many years focused on the next practical step to have energy left over for holding things against people. The girls came to the property for the first time in October, when the work on the farmhouse was far enough along that it was comfortable and the leaves on the trees at the property line had turned the dark gold and copper of eastern Kentucky in the fall. She drove them out on a Saturday, the two of them in the back seat asking questions with the unself-conscious frequency of children who did not yet know that some questions were hard to answer, and she answered each one as honestly and as completely as she could. They walked the property together in the afternoon light, crossing the fields, circling the barn, stepping carefully through the restored farmhouse where the pine floors gleamed from their cleaning and the wood stove stood ready with fresh split wood beside it. The younger girl asked if they could come back. Nora said yes. The older one asked if this was really theirs. Nora said it was. The older one was quiet for a moment, looking out the farmhouse window at the fields and the bare-limbed trees and the sky going orange above the ridgeline. And then she said it was beautiful. And Nora looked at the same view and thought about the morning she had arrived here and the darkness in her kitchen and the notebook of numbers that never balanced and the specific quality of exhaustion that came from managing alone for so long that you forgot what it felt like not to. She thought about a man who had watched his sister raise this daughter and had trusted what he saw and had kept his silence and his secret until he could arrange it correctly and had then arranged it correctly without knowing if she would ever walk through his door. She thought about all the ways a life could change on the edge of an ordinary decision and how rarely you could see them coming and how much it mattered when a moment arrived to have been the kind of person who stopped and looked at what was in front of you instead of walking over it without noticing. She placed her hand on the window frame of Raymond's farmhouse and looked at the land and thought that the most honest thing she could say about everything that had happened was this. She had not been lucky. Or she had been lucky, but luck was not the whole of it, and maybe not even the most of it. What she had been was attentive. She had walked into a barn she could easily have walked through quickly, and she had looked at a floor she had no particular reason to look at carefully, and she had been quiet enough and still enough and practiced enough at noticing things others overlooked to see what was there to be seen. A lifetime of having to notice details to survive had made her the exact person Raymond had needed her to be. She did not know if he had calculated that or simply trusted it. She thought it was probably something between the two, the way most true things were. The light continued to fail in the way of October evenings, gold tipping toward gray, the ridge going dark against the sky. She watched it with her daughters beside her and felt, for the first time and longer than she could name, the particular and ordinary grace of a woman standing in a place she owned at the end of a day that had been good, with nothing overdue and nothing threatening and nothing that required managing before she could allow herself to rest. She thought of Raymond one more time before the light was fully gone. She thought of him sitting at this table with this knowledge under his floor and this view out this window and this quiet all around him, and she thought that whatever he had done or not done with what he found, he had been, at the bottom of it, a man who understood that some things were meant to be kept until the right person came along to receive them. He had kept it. He had kept it long and well and alone. And then he had given it to her, not easily or quickly or with any of the grand gestures that stories about things like this usually required. He had given it to her the same way he had done everything else in his life, quietly, precisely, and with complete confidence that she would know what to do. She had known what to do. She was still doing it. She expected she would be doing it for a long time to come. That was what enough looked like, she thought. Not a destination you arrived at and then stopped, but a ground you stood on that was solid enough to build from. She had the ground now. She intended to build carefully, the same way she had always done everything, step by step, and with both eyes open, for as long as the ground held. And it was going to hold for a long time. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.